72 hours before the cranberry sauce was passed, I was standing on a rooftop in Beirut. The rain wasn't the romantic kind that washes the world clean. It was a gritty, oily sludge that fell from a sky the color of a bruised plum. It smelled of diesel, uncollected trash, and the metallic tang of ozone. My boots, standard issue for civilians but reinforced with ceramic plating for my line of work, gripped the wet concrete ledge. "Director," a voice crackled in my earpiece. It was distinct, void of static, the result of encryption technology that wouldn't exist for the general public for another 2 decades. "Asset is secure. Extraction team is taking fire at the rendezvous point. We need authorization for the Overwatch protocols." I didn't blink. Down below, in the labyrinth of the city, a man named Hassan, a deep-cover operative who had spent 3 years infiltrating a weapons smuggling ring, was bleeding out in a van. "Negative on Overwatch," I said. My voice was low, barely a whisper, yet it carried across the encrypted network with the weight of absolute law. "There are civilians in the blast radius. Switch to Route Charlie. Deploy the flashbangs and use the smoke cover. If you drop a bomb in that sector, we lose the political capital to get him out of the country." "Copy that, Director. Switching to Charlie." I waited. The seconds ticked by, measured not by a clock, but by the rhythm of my own pulse, which remained steady at 55 beats per minute. 3 minutes later. "We are clear. Asset is in the bird. We are wheels up." "Good work," I said. "Wipe the logs." I was never here. I dropped the sat phone into my pocket, turned, and walked down the fire escape. By the time I reached the street, I had already shifted my posture. My shoulders slumped slightly. My gait shortened. The predatory grace of the director of Skyfall evaporated, replaced by the invisible shuffle of Elena, the spinster archivist. I caught a commercial flight back to DC 6 hours later, flying economy class, wedged between a crying toddler and a man eating an egg salad sandwich. I read a paperback mystery novel, pretending to be engrossed, while in my mind I was reallocating a black-budget slush fund larger than the GDP of Iceland to cover the cleanup costs in Lebanon. This was the dichotomy of my existence. I lived in the spaces between the lines of history books. I was the architect of international safety, the woman who decided who lived and who died in the dark. And yet, the thing that terrified me most wasn't the rooftop in Beirut. It was the impending Thanksgiving dinner at my parents' house in suburban Virginia. While I was landing at Dulles, my brother-in-law Mark was likely fighting a war of his own. Mark worked for the agency. That was how my sister Chloe introduced him at parties. She would lower her voice, raise her eyebrows, and whisper, "Mark is with the agency," as if he were a modern-day James Bond carrying a license to kill in his wallet. The reality was far more beige. Mark was a GS-11 analyst. He worked in a cubicle farm in a sub-basement at Langley. His clearance level was secret, which sounds impressive to civilians but is essentially the participation trophy of the intelligence community. His specific domain was logistics and supply chain management for non-critical European sectors. In layman's terms, Mark tracked office furniture. He spent his days ensuring that the embassy in Brussels had enough ergonomic chairs and that the consulate in Frankfurt wasn't overspending on printer toner. He fought valiant battles against Excel spreadsheets and engaged in covert operations to secure the goods stapler from the supply closet. I knew this because I had read his file. I read everyone's file. But to my family, Mark was a titan. He was the line in the sand. He was the shield. And I was the cautionary tale. I arrived at my parents' house at 4 p.m. on Thursday. The house was a monument to upper-middle-class aspiration. Manicured lawn, a wreath on the door made of artisanal dried wheat, and a Mercedes in the driveway that my father leased to Project Success. When I walked in, carrying a bottle of Pinot Noir that cost $12, the wall of heat and judgment hit me instantly. "Elena!" my mother, Carol, cried out. She didn't hug me. She patted my arm as if checking for dust. "You made it. And look at you, wearing that beige sweater again. It washes you out, dear. You disappear into the walls. It's comfortable, Mom, I said, stepping past her. Comfort is the enemy of ambition, she recited, a line she had probably read in a magazine. My father, Robert, was in the living room, pouring a scotch. There she is, he said, offering a benevolent, pitying smile. How's the library? Still quiet? Very quiet, Dad. We're digitizing the 1920 census records. Fascinating, he said, his eyes already glazing over. You know, Mark was telling us about his week. Incredible stuff. High stakes. I can imagine, I said, suppressing a smirk. I knew Mark's high-stakes week involved a frantic search for a missing crate of paperclips destined for Munich. Then, Chloe swept into the room. My older sister was a force of nature, if nature consisted entirely of hairspray, insecurity, and the desperate need to be the protagonist of every room she entered. She was wearing a dress that cost more than my car, and she held a glass of white wine like a scepter. Elena, she sighed, looking me up and down. You're late. Mark has been holding court for 20 minutes, and you missed the part about the classified briefing. I'm sure he'll retell it, I said. He shouldn't have to, Chloe snapped, linking her arm through mine and dragging me toward the dining room. But he will, because he's gracious. Unlike some people who can't even be bothered to date. We entered the dining room. The table was set with the good china, the crystal goblets shimmering under the chandelier. Mark stood by the fireplace, one hand in his pocket, swirling his drink. He looked the part, handsome in a generic way, jawline soft from desk work, eyes bright with the unearned confidence of a mediocre man. Elena, Mark said, nodding gravely. Good to see you. Security at the library tight these days? Check any bags for overdue fines? He laughed. My parents laughed. Chloe laughed. I smiled, the same smile I used when negotiating with warlords who thought they had the upper hand. Just the usual, Mark. How's Brussels? Did the requisition order for the swivel chairs go through? Mark froze for a microsecond. A flicker of confusion crossed his face. How did I know about the chairs? But he quickly dismissed it. You know I can't talk about specifics, Elle. Operational security. Right, I said. OPSEC. Of course. I took my seat at the far end of the table, the designated spot for the single, childless daughter. The stage was set. The players were in position, and I was just trying to survive until dessert. 2 hours later, the air in the room was thick enough to choke on. It smelled of roasted turkey, sage stuffing, and my sister's suffocating arrogance. The appetizers had been a masterclass in belittlement. Chloe had spent 40 minutes constructing a shrine to her husband's career, while systematically dismantling mine. It was a two-pronged attack. Elevate Mark to godhood, reduce Elena to dust. It's just so hard for him, Chloe was saying, her hand resting possessively on Mark's shoulder. He carries the weight of the world, literally. Last month, when he went to DC for that conference, I didn't hear from him for 3 days. Total radio silence. He said it was a blackout protocol. I took a slow sip of my cheap wine. The blackout protocol was actually Mark losing his phone charger at the Marriott in Bethesda during a supply chain logistics seminar. I knew this because I had flagged his frantic emails to IT from my secure terminal, mostly for my own amusement. Must be terrifying, my mother said, looking at Mark with wide, adoring eyes. Knowing you're the only thing standing between us and, well, chaos. Mark sighed, a heavy, theatrical exhalation. He puffed out his chest, the buttons of his dress shirt straining slightly. It's the job, Carol. We don't do it for the glory. We do it because if we don't, who will? He looked around the table, making eye contact with everyone, ensuring his martyrdom was acknowledged. When his eyes landed on me, his expression shifted to a patronizing smirk. But hey, he said, lightening the mood. We need people like Elena, too. Someone has to make sure the history books are filed correctly, right? It's safe. Quiet. Exactly, Chloe chimed in, leaning forward. She had that look in her eye, the shark-smelling blood. It's sweet, really. Mark saves the world, and Elena saves receipts. The table chuckled, a polite, orchestrated sound that grated on my nerves like sandpaper. I mean, be honest, Elle, Chloe continued, pouring herself more wine. Do you even have security clearance to enter the staff room at the library? Or do you have to wait outside with the interns until someone lets you in? Laughter again. My father slapped the table, delighted by the wit. My mind flashed back to a week ago. I was in the SCIF, Sensitive Compartmented Information Facility, at the Pentagon. I was standing toe-to-toe with a 3-star general who thought his rank gave him the right to scream at me about a delayed extraction. I remembered the way the room went silent when I cut him off. I remembered stepping into his personal space, my voice barely a whisper. General, under Protocol 7 Alpha, my authority supersedes your stars. You will stand down, or I will have your clearance revoked before you can blink. Do I make myself clear? I remembered the color draining from his face. I remembered the way a room full of powerful men shrank when they realized who held the leash. But here I was just Elena. I have a badge, I said meekly, staring at my mashed potatoes. It gets me into the archives. A badge, Mark chuckled. Cute. You know, in my world, a badge is just a target. That's why we operate in the shadows. He leaned in, lowering his voice to a conspiratorial whisper. The wine had loosened his tongue, and his ego was driving the car. There are rumors, Mark said, about a unit called Skyfall. It's a spook story we tell the junior analysts. A division that doesn't exist on any org chart. They say they handle the wet works, the assassinations, the black bag jobs that even the CIA won't touch. My heart didn't race, but my focus sharpened to a razor's edge. Skyfall. He shouldn't know that name. It meant the rumors were leaking from the upper echelons down to the basement. I made a mental note to order an internal security audit of the mid-level analyst chat rooms on Monday. Skyfall? My father asked. Sounds like a movie. It's real, Mark insisted, thrilled by the attention. They say the operatives are ghosts. No names, no families, just a tattoo. A hawk plummeting inside a geometric storm. If you see that brand, you run, because you're already dead. He paused for effect, letting the spook story settle over the table. He was enjoying the fear he was projecting, borrowing valor from monsters he had never met. He had no idea the monster was sitting 3 feet away, buttering a dinner roll. Reality intruded on Mark's fantasy in the form of a vibration. His phone buzzed on the table. It was a standard-issue agency BlackBerry, clunky, outdated, and unsecure. He glanced at it and frowned. Work, he muttered, trying to look important. Probably a crisis in the Eastern Bloc. It was likely an automated alert that the cafeteria menu had changed. A second later, a low, rhythmic hum vibrated against my thigh. It wasn't a text. It wasn't a call. It was a Priority 1 haptic alert. The kind of signal that overrides all silence modes. The kind of signal that means the world is burning. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my device. It didn't look like an iPhone. It didn't look like an Android. It was a matte black slab, slightly thicker than a commercial phone, with a reinforced chassis and no brand logo. The screen was polarized privacy glass. From the side, it looked black. From my angle, it was flashing red. I moved to silence it, but Mark's eyes caught the movement. He stopped his story mid-sentence. He stared at the device in my hand. Mark wasn't a spy, but he was a logistics analyst. He knew hardware. He knew specs. He spent his life looking at requisition forms for government tech. Elena, he said, his brow furrowing. The bravado slipped, replaced by genuine confusion. Is that Is that an encrypted burst transmitter? The table went quiet. What? Chloe asked, laughing nervously. Don't be silly. It's probably some ancient brick she bought at a thrift store. Elena is so cheap. No, Mark said slowly. He pointed a fork at the phone. That's a Model X secure terminal. It has a heavy-duty battery case and a localized scrambler port at the bottom. I've seen the specs for those. That is field issue level 5 tech. He looked up at my face, trying to reconcile the librarian with the hardware. Why does a librarian have a secure comms device? I slipped the phone back into my pocket with practiced nonchalance. It's just an old model I found online, Mark, I said, my voice flat and uninteresting. I'm frugal. I don't upgrade until I have to. It's durable. I drop things a lot. It was a flimsy lie, but it was usually enough for civilians. Mark seemed to waver. He wanted to believe it. He needed to believe it. Because if he didn't, his entire worldview was at risk. Right, he muttered, shaking his head. Surplus. Makes sense. You probably got ripped off. Those things are useless without the cryptographic key. Probably, I agreed. But Chloe couldn't stand it. She couldn't stand that for 30 seconds. The attention had shifted to me. She couldn't stand that Mark had asked me a question that wasn't an insult. She needed to reassert dominance. She needed to remind everyone who the star was and who the extra was. She reached across the table. Her eyes locked onto my wrist. Oh, speaking of being frugal, she sneered, her voice high and brittle. Is that the same cheap charm bracelet you've had since college? I saw it peeking out. God, Elena, treat yourself for once. You're 30 years old. I froze. It's nothing, Chloe. Let me see, she insisted. I bet it's that tacky silver thing with the cats on it. Chloe, stop, I said. My voice dropped an octave. It wasn't the librarian's voice anymore, but she didn't hear the warning. She just saw resistance, and resistance made her aggressive. She reached out and grabbed my forearm. Don't be such a prude, she laughed. And she yanked. She didn't just pull the sleeve, she wrenched it upward. The beige cashmere rode up, just 2 inches, but 2 inches was enough. The flickering candlelight caught the ink. It wasn't a charm bracelet, it wasn't a butterfly, it wasn't a generic tribal band. It was black, stark, and deeply saturated. A jagged brand of a hawk, wings swept back in a terminal stoop, diving through a chaotic, geometric storm of fractured lines. It looked less like art, and more like a warning label on a weapon. The Skyfall sigil. For a second, the room was still. The only sound was the hum of the refrigerator in the other room. I felt a familiar rush of adrenaline. Not the flighty panic of a civilian, but the cold, crystalline focus of an operator entering the kill box. I looked at Mark. I watched the color drain from his face. It didn't fade. It vanished, as if someone had pulled a plug in his heels. His eyes went wide, pupils dilating in pure, primal fight-or-flight terror. His reaction was immediate and violent. Mark scrambled backward, his legs tangled in the legs of his expensive dining chair. He went down hard, the chair crashing to the floor with a deafening wooden crack. He didn't even try to catch himself. He crab-walked backward on the rug, kicking his heels, desperate to put distance between himself and my wrist. Let go of her arm, Chloe, he hissed. His voice was strangled, a high-pitched wheeze that sounded nothing like the confident man of 5 minutes ago. Let go now! Chloe froze. Her hand hovered in the air, still gripping my sleeve. She looked from the mark on my skin to her husband on the floor, her face a mask of utter confusion. What is wrong with you? She asked, a nervous laugh bubbling up. Mark, get up. You're embarrassing me. It's just a tattoo. Probably some trashy thing she got during a breakup. God, you are so dramatic. That's not a tattoo, Mark whispered. He pointed a shaking finger at me. He refused to look me in the eye, as if looking at me directly would turn him to stone. "That's a unit designation," he stammered. "Skyfall isn't a place, and it's not a desk job." He looked at his wife, desperate to make her understand the gravity of the mistake she had just made. "It's the call sign for Shadowside operations. They don't have archives, Chloe. They have kill lists." The silence that followed was heavy enough to crush a lung. I watched Mark connect the dots. I watched his mind race through every classified rumor he'd ever heard, every redacted file he'd been denied access to, every whispered story in the cafeteria. He was realizing that the ghost he feared, the boogeyman of the intelligence community, was sitting across from him, passing the gravy. He looked at me. Really looked at me. He saw the stillness. He saw the lack of fear. He saw the callus on my trigger finger. He saw the way I sat facing the exit. "You," he wheezed. "You're not an archivist. You're the station chief. You're the one who signs the burn orders." I didn't deny it. There was no point in the charade anymore. The curtain had been ripped down, and the stage was burning. I slowly, deliberately rolled my sleeve back down, covering the sigil. I locked eyes with him. I let the full weight of my level 5 clearance bear down on him. I let him see the director. "Sit down, analyst," I said softly. The command was quiet, but it carried the absolute authority of a superior officer. It wasn't a request. It was an order from God. Mark sat. He pulled his chair up. He didn't argue. He didn't joke. He slumped into his seat, instinctively obeying the chain of command, his hands trembling in his lap. My parents sat in stunned silence, their forks hovering halfway to their mouths. They looked at me as if I had just grown a second head. Chloe, however, couldn't process it. Her narcissism was a powerful shield. She let out a shrill, disbelief-laden laugh. "Don't be ridiculous," she scoffed, though her voice wavered. "She's just Elena. She organizes books. Mark, you've had too much wine. Tell him, Elena. Tell him he's being crazy." Then the table vibrated again. My phone buzzed. The screen lit up. Priority encryption. Code red. Operation Nightshade. My hands were still greasy from the turkey. I didn't have time to clean them. I tapped the speaker button without hesitation. The voice that filled the dining room was distorted, metallic, and utterly devoid of humanity. "Director, Operation Nightshade is green lit. We have visual on the target. Asset is in the kill box. We need your biometric authorization key to deploy the drone wing." The words hung in the air, alien and terrifying in the suburban dining room. Kill box. Drone wing. Director. I didn't look at my family. I leaned forward, speaking into the device in a language none of them recognized. Technical, precise, and lethal. "Authorization Alpha 9 Zulu," I said, my voice icy calm. "Confirm coordinates. Sector 4, Grid 7. Minimize collateral damage. Execute." "Copy, Director. Birds are away. Impact in T-minus 30 seconds. I tapped the screen to end the call. I looked up. The silence wasn't just quiet anymore. It was a vacuum. It sucked the oxygen out of the room and left my family gasping in the sudden, harsh clarity of the truth. I looked around the table. I saw my mother, pale and trembling, realizing that the daughter she critiqued for being boring was currently ordering airstrikes. I saw my father, looking at me like a stranger who had broken into his house. And I saw Chloe. Her face was a mask of pale, unadulterated shock. Her narrative, the one where she was the star and I was the extra, had just been incinerated by a drone strike. I calmly picked up my linen napkin, the specific shade of cream Chloe had agonized over for 45 minutes. I deliberately dabbed the corner of my mouth. I placed it on the table, the soft fabric making a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the stillness. I looked at my sister. "The turkey was dry, Chloe," I said. My voice was devoid of malice. It was simply a fact, like the physics of a missile, like the rain in Beirut. I pushed my chair back and stood up. The movement was fluid and sharp. The slouch was gone. The librarian was gone. Mark remained frozen in his chair. He looked small. He looked like exactly what he was. A man who filled out forms for a living and played pretend on the weekends. "Elena," he started, his voice thin and brittle. Do I need to report this contact? Because of the clearance conflict? If you're operating under Title 50 Covert Action Authority, and I've witnessed a command sequence, I might be in violation of..." He trailed off. His rules and regulations were failing him. He was trying to apply bureaucracy to a hurricane. I looked down at him, and for the first time, I felt a twinge of genuine pity. "Don't worry, Mark," I said softly, leaning in just enough to make him flinch. "You don't have high enough clearance to even report me." He blinked, tears of fear welling in his eyes. "If you tried to type my call sign into your system," I continued, "your terminal would just go dark. Men in suits would be at your desk in 5 minutes. You would spend the next 6 months in a windowless room in Nevada, answering questions you don't understand." Mark went white. "As far as the agency is concerned, I was never here," I said. "This dinner never happened. And you?" I let the silence stretch, heavy and suffocating. "You are just a supply analyst who had too much wine." I didn't wait for a response. I turned and walked toward the front door, my heels clicking on the hardwood floor with a rhythmic precision that sounded like a countdown. My parents sat like statues. They didn't ask where I was going. They didn't ask when I would be back. They realized, perhaps for the first time, that they had never really known the person eating at their table. I opened the heavy front door and stepped out into the cool night air. The suburban quiet was instantly broken by the presence of my reality. A black government SUV with tinted windows and reinforced plating was idling at the curb. It was a beast of a machine, armored against small arms fire and IEDs, its engine purring with a low, menacing rumble. It looked like a predator lurking among the minivans and sedans of the cul-de-sac. As I descended the porch steps, the rear door opened. 2 large men in dark suits stepped out. They scanned the perimeter with professional paranoia. They didn't wave. They didn't smile. One of them, a man named Riggs who had pulled me out of a firefight in Damascus 2 years ago, simply nodded and held the door. "Director," he murmured. "Extraction team is green. We have a bird waiting at Andrews." "Good," I said. "Let's go." A title that carried more weight in one word than sister or daughter ever had in a lifetime. I slid into the leather interior. The smell of gun oil, conditioned air, and sterile efficiency replaced the scent of overcooked poultry and desperation. As the heavy door slammed shut, sealing me back into my world, I looked out the tinted window. Through the gap in the curtains of the dining room window, I saw them. My family. They were huddled together, peering out into the dark. Chloe was crying. Mark was holding his head in his hands. My parents looked like ghosts haunting their own home. They were watching the red taillights of my convoy fade into the distance. They looked like children watching a storm roll in, small, confused, and completely helpless against the elements. 3 months have passed since that night. I haven't been back for a Sunday dinner. The invitations have stopped coming. No more group texts. No more passive-aggressive voicemails from Chloe about my lack of ambition. From what I hear through the grapevine, and by grapevine I mean the surveillance reports I occasionally glance at when I have downtime, the fallout was absolute. Chloe and Mark are separated, pending divorce. It wasn't the secrecy that broke them. It was the humiliation. Chloe is a woman who needs her husband to be a titan to validate her own self-worth. She couldn't survive the image of him cowering before her invisible little sister. The fantasy she had built her life around shattered the moment she saw fear in his eyes. She couldn't respect him anymore, and he couldn't look at her without remembering how small he felt. I received a single email from Mark last week. It was sent to my old civilian email address, the one I only check for spam. It had no subject line. The body of the message was just one sentence. I didn't say anything. It was a plea for mercy. A confirmation that he was keeping my secret, not out of loyalty, but out of self-preservation. He knows that in my world, loose ends get tied off. He is terrified of becoming a loose end. I deleted the email without replying. I sat back in my chair, the one in the corner office with the view of the Potomac, the one with the biometric locks and the direct line to the president. I thought about the years of silence I had endured. I thought about the Thanksgiving dinners where I was interrupted, the birthdays where I was given gift cards to bookstores because they didn't know what I liked, the endless, patronizing lectures about finding a stable job. I used to think my silence was a weakness. I used to think I failed to assert myself. Now I realize it was camouflage. The loudest people in the room are usually the weakest. They fill the air with noise because they are terrified of what the silence might reveal about their own mediocrity. They build monuments to themselves out of words because they have no deeds to stand on. True power doesn't need to brag at a dinner table. True power doesn't need to be acknowledged by a sister who measures success in designer handbags, or a father who measures it in loud stories. True power is the ability to change the world without anyone knowing your name until it's too late for them to do anything about it. My sister spent her whole life trying to be the main character of a spy novel. She never realized she was just the comic relief in a documentary. And me? I don't need their applause. I have the hawk. I have the storm. And I have work to do.